Okay, we can start. Sorry about the delay. Let me now share my screen. Okay, so yeah, so I created a list of things here that, or list of items here that are currently implemented and not implemented. Not to say that the ones that are currently implemented are the ones we want to do. I just wanted to make that clear and as a starting point. So, Graeme, maybe we can just go through your comments.
Yeah, sure. That would probably be the most effective use of the time we have here.
Mm-hmm.
Before I start going through them in depth, I just want to give two quick kind of background pieces as well, just so that everyone's aware for the larger part of where I'm kind of looking at this piece. We in the SRE core infra team are talking about console servers around Postgres SQL and the Rails console servers as well. So it doesn't have to necessarily feed into this, but there's a discussion ongoing in general around console servers. And part of that is we're talking with the security team on what actually GitLab as a company in terms of endpoint security and our model for security in terms of things like Bastion hosts, VPNs, lack of VPNs, IAP, all that stuff kind of makes sense of. So I've been looking at that with them on that part as well, which is why I might have some slightly different direction or opinions, because I'm kind of keeping that in the back of my mind as well. But that doesn't necessarily have to affect here. It's just, this is a part of potentially a larger strategy and implementation that could take place.
Which team exactly is that? Who's leading that effort?
So that is part of the core infra team in SRE.
Sorry. Yeah, from the security side.
The security side, I can get, so David Smith would know, but I can get you the names that they've actually. So there's Craig Barrett, I believe, who's been looking at it from my team, and I've been talking to him a bit. And then there's people there's a manager, I believe, from the security team. I feel really bad. I don't have the name off the top of my head.
No worries. But, just link it in Slack to me because sure. I want to know so we can sync.
So Graeme, are you saying that you think it's a good idea that we combine these efforts, or are you thinking that we shouldn't combine the efforts?
I think we should be aware of each of them, but I do understand they're very different, because one is more about general developer access, like people who are always going to be less privileged, and we are higher privileged. So I think the argument could be made that they're different enough, but it would be good to see if there's some common ground they could find.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, a more generalized approach for getting production access is very similar to what we're talking about here, and like getting Rails console access for SREs and getting kubectl access for SREs. Though one is more about accessing red data, they both have the potential to inflict damage and cause issues if you think you're on the wrong environment. So I was thinking they're kind of similar, but yeah, that's good to know, and maybe there's a partnership we can explore there.
Absolutely. And I think in general, the security team sees the difference as well. Like a person who only uses their laptop to access GitLab or some web applications is very different from our team that are, accessing servers. So my first point, I guess, I'll cover very quickly is, once again, way I was thinking about this as well, is breaking the problem down into two areas. There's where do we run these tools? So do we run them for a laptop, Bastion server, Cloud Run? What's the pros and cons from each approach? And then also where you run it, is slightly different to what can you do and how do we protect people from breaking stuff and doing the wrong thing. So yeah, my second point there is what I've just mentioned. We're talking about security perspective with the security team beyond core. What does that mean? How do we secure endpoints being our laptops? So I won't go into that anymore. Same with the discussion around Rails and DB console servers if people are interested. I guess the big part of my, I want to understand and explore this more as well is, are we trying to define a process that is going to work for every environment? So like pre-staging and production. Are we just only interested in production because, that's the most important? If we are just interested in production, should we extend this from, just production? We have a production Vault cluster now, and the reason that is separate is for security isolation. We may have other services like license.gitlab.com, which is also production, but has a separate cluster due to PCI compliance and things like that. So I think it's not a big deal, but we do need to understand that when we say production now, it does extend to multiple Kubernetes clusters that operate slightly differently.
Yeah, I think we should divide that into production and non-production at the very high level, and then maybe would you know, maybe we stratify underneath that is for non-prod to have different environments split out. But I don't think from a security and isolation perspective, prod and non-prod are probably the minimal requirement there.
Agree, Jarv. So the whole point of this is not to make everyone's lives more difficult.
Agreed.
It is ensuring that we don't do anything accidental like we already did, and we just starting on this route. So for me, production is not only gitlab.com, it is license, it is everything that has read data, basically, right?
And so the other point I'll kind of mention here, and once again, I'm just bringing a lot of data in to consider, maybe not necessarily bringing solutions to the problem yet, is with environments like pre, which we currently have exposed to the internet, and because it's a non-production, we don't do the level of security we do have on production. We have to be aware that, especially the security team may start to consider that as, like, we may have to consider that whatever we do for access, whether it's Cloud Shell or Bash, whatever it is, we may actually have to extend that to non-production clusters if the security team deems that we need to get all of our clusters off the internet. Whatever solution.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work like that, right? Like they can deem it, but we can also argue that that's not the case, right? Like pre has no data, like it has nothing in there. There is no sensitive information. So, you know, it can be argued either way.
Sure, that's fine. The only thing I will state is two reasons. If someone compromises pre, I don't know the full details, but what someone kind of commented on one of that issue with regarding to review sites and stuff is that if someone compromises pre, I think there's still a potential for us to have to pay out things like HackerOne bounties and things like that. So there's a financial risk to the company. And if someone compromises something like pre, they can also use that as a jumping point for further penetrations into the network, which once again, I think that's kind of low because we've isolated with different VPCs. And I'm not arguing either way. I'm just saying that this is something to be aware of that people may have differing opinions about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, I was going to say, like, I think if we come up with a solution that's workable, I think we would just extend it to pre. And the only reason right now, and I just wrote this down, the only reason is that, as you know, it's very difficult to run Helm against the cluster without using SSH tunneling. And I think if we fix that, and I think we need to fix it anyway for prod and staging, then we would just do the same thing for pre-prod.
Sure. Cool. So I agree. I think even pre aside, our auto DevOps clusters, like, as I said, license to GitLab.com is set up all wrong. We need to fix that. So there's a lot of, this is more of a, if we come up with a good solution, I think we can use it everywhere anyway. So in terms of actual ideas and solutions, what I do and don't like is I like personally leveraging more on things like RBAC control and explicitly denying and using least privilege for our users rather than necessarily relying on other controls like blocking access or using wrappers around tools per se. Not saying that they're wrong, just that I would much rather see us fully embrace a model. At the moment, we are all G-Cloud admins, so therefore we are admins in every Kubernetes cluster everywhere. I would love to see us actually configure our systems where all of us only have read-only access to all of our Kubernetes clusters. And then that way, no matter what tool you use, no matter what system you're on, it is literally impossible for you to say delete the entire deployment for GitLab or things like that. So literally using RBAC to make it impossible for us to do the wrong thing. But once again, that's only part of the problem. That doesn't solve where do we run our tools, how do we access things and things like that. So I was thinking about this more today. What I was wondering, or an idea or a different way of looking at things is, at the moment, we have that wrapper. You can go on a console server, you can have a wrapper to do what you need to do, and that's great. But what I was wondering is if we move to a model, or something to think about is if we move to a model where we have no special permissions, but we have a process for what is essentially doing a sudo or a su on, like SU onto the cluster. So like whether it's a Cloud Shell, a special container that gets spun up, it's a chat ops job, whatever. And that is explicitly controlled. You need to, have good reason for doing that. You need to link an issue, or there's tightly controlled around that, and it records the entire session. And I think this is important. I like the idea of recording more of our sessions. I think we can kind of look at maybe a good compromise with things where if people at the moment want to log on and have a look at something in production cluster, maybe they want to look at the configuration flags of a pod, or like from kube proxy, something we don't deploy. Or if they want to look at the number of like connections we have for a particular service or anything like that, they still have to go through our authorization and wrapper process, which kind of makes sense even for read-only operations. So at the moment, our gateway to production is just purely, are you doing something to production, yes or no? It's not necessarily what are you doing production? Are you just looking at something? Are you changing something? So I'm wondering if maybe we change the model to, if we have a secure way of access, maybe it's just a Bastion server, but we allow people read-only access so they can look at anything they want, without any extra tool, or they can run a tool that they want to do to look at things, that's fine. But maybe if people do want to actually change something, or if there's a level of privilege or a security we don't want them to have, there's a standard process for accessing that, and we tightly control that. So it becomes more of a, right now, everyone can kind of just do anything. Anyone can read anything against production. They can look at things and do whatever they want. And mostly, you'd want to, things most people do will be looking at logs and things like that. So they'll probably just go to logging systems. But there are times, especially when we're trying to understand some of the deeper stuff or debug things or what have you, that it's nice just being able to jump on and look at things. So maybe making that easier for people to do, and allowing things like read-only access via an SSH tunnel or something like that. But then when anyone wants to change anything, there's a really tight change control process that captures everything they do. So maybe leveraging that permissions model, as I said, I kind of liken it to getting sudo on a machine, like you sudo up and then, you've got the real permissions. That could be a different way of looking at it.
No, I understand where you're coming from. I'm not against it completely. What concerns me is this context switch of what am I doing on my machine versus what I'm doing on a Bastion host.
Sure.
I am a firm believer of Bastion hosts that, if they're rightly configured and set up, are the only proper way of doing things. Like, I don't want access, I don't want people to randomly do things from their machines. Like, it's as simple as that. So I think your combo of proper controls, what kind of actions are you doing, and then the most important thing of it all, like audit logs for everything you do. Like, I honestly don't really think that we should make a difference between are you reading or are you writing. I think we should always have all the logs of all of the operations somewhere, because ultimately you don't know whether we're going to get a bad actor in the team that read secrets, right?
Yeah,
like
secrets,
you don't know, right? Sorry, Jared, do you want to ask questions before I continue? Because I have a bit of a set of questions.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm kind of on the same page as that. I wrote some comments here. So one is like, I am sort of in agreement with Maren here that in my experience, like I would try to get people off of their workstations, because what inevitably happens is that people will store keys on their workstations, and that's probably not the worst thing in the world, but I think we want to avoid that. And we also want to just have a consistent setup and a quick onboarding for SREs who go on call. Like, we want to have like a consistent environment and a consistent way to run Helm. I think that I like the idea of the pseudo approach, and I was thinking like maybe we just have a chat-ops command or something that we run to say, okay, I want to escalate my user permission for 6 hours or something like that, and that way, instead of having like a separate key, you could even just have like, you know, you modify the user permissions. Yeah, and then it would just revert it back after so many hours.
Right.
I'm still like,
but you then need to think about cleanup. You need to think about how do you ensure that this access is now correct, and like you have to have tools around confirming that, versus saying that you have a single login. I'm going to use wrong words here, so bear with me. Like you have a single account that logs everything, logs who actually is the person that logged into this super user account and what kind of operations they did. Once they log out, they're like no one else, like that account is secure in its own, like there is no cleanup necessary as long as the logout happens, right? Like from that point, I think it might be simpler, and like it would require less tooling than actually confirming whether after 6 hours something expired. We know there are bugs, for example, in our soft delete where sometimes we don't delete stuff, right? Which is not great.
Sure. So if we want to, like, I think we need to explore the second account approach where we either have a service account or even like a separate Google account that is, you know, just for this sort of thing. I mean, that would work as well. And I think this in combination, I'm still sort of stuck on this console approach because it sounds to me like, you know, we all agree that we need bastions, but we all also agree that we can't have a shared server. And the only way I could reconcile that is to create individual console hosts that maybe function as bastions as well, that you would just spin up. And I'm not sure like if we could somehow measure the inactivity, although I think they're pretty cheap. You know, if you have a small instance, it's not very expensive to keep running for every SRE. So maybe that's, maybe that is where we land. I'm not sure. So anyway, Marion, you can continue if you want.
No, not to mention that you can use just containers, boot them up, someone logs out, get them down, and that's it, right? Like it's not gonna, honestly, security is more important here because that costs us more, ultimately, regardless of a machine that runs 24 hours a day, right? But Graeme, my questions are mostly related to, we all know, like we are somewhat in an agreement which way we want to go, right? Like I think we are in the bastion host type of territory, also with proper permission set on the account, on the cluster. You know, read actions should be logged, but also write actions, like everything should be logged. My question comes from where we are at now versus where we want to be is a serious amount of work. So what is the absolute minimum that you think we can do this very moment to ensure that A, we can still do work in production, and B, still be super secure, somewhat more secure than we are right now about it? And what do you also think about the additional wrappers that we have where they're asking you about issues, you know, like, and things like that? Does that still need to exist then?
So I think, so the first thing that probably needs to happen is we need to figure out some way to provide a privileged access shell that's like somehow we can provide some privileged access shell to people. Once we have that, and we know a way of people that can escalate to that, then we can reduce our permissions, because we can't do one before that. We can't reduce our permissions if we haven't got a way to get elevated permissions in case. So I think the first step is, how do we construct whatever way it is to get some kind of controlled elevated session? The second step would be to reduce our RBAC permissions gently. And that's easy to do. That's very trivial to do. It's just a manifest. We can slowly step that down. And then I guess the third step, I think for production, that will give us a huge boost. I think that for production, that is great. For other environments like pre and things like that, there's other things like how do we get them behind bastions and things like that, which I think are further steps that may be trickier. The only thing I will mention though is I'm a little bit hung up on like running things on laptops versus bastion hosts and stuff, because if you actually look at the Beyond Corp structure, which is the structure we as a company are following, it's about endpoint security at your laptop. Like there's no Bastion host. They're deploying management software, that they're rolling out management software on all our laptops to remote white. It's about securing your laptop as the endpoint. And I'm not saying I agree with it or not. And I run a Linux laptop, so.
I know. I don't think that should apply to us. Honestly, like this silly notion of third party running on your laptop, like having a backdoor on your laptop, and that will be secure. Like that is, in my opinion, something that begins with letter P.
Sure.
And Graeme, I think the points you're making are valid, but I also think for me, the priority is ensuring that we have a consistent environment for the on-call. And I do not see a way to do that with people running Helm against their laptop to ensure that the versions are the same of kubectl, that someone isn't running Helm 3 by accident and they're running Helm 2. All of these things, like maybe we do a combination of both, but I think at the minimum for me is to have a standard environment for everyone.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and that's fine. So I guess my second question would be is, and maybe this is a bit selfish on my behalf, but so makes sense production. So if this is something we want to move all our environments behind, let's say things like pre and stuff, we start putting that behind Bastions. What is the desired workflow for doing development against those clusters? Like if I want to do GitLab Helm files work, how do I do that? At the moment, I can do it on my laptop and I can talk to pre. Is that something we always expect, or do we make an exception for non-production clusters and say, you know what, those non-production clusters where we're doing development work, we're going to allow Cloud VPN or some tunnel to make things easier? That is really the only question that's left for me. I have no problems, you know, with consistent shell and everything. I will admit, I'm more concerned about the workflow for doing development work. And it affects me a lot because I have a huge latency to the US. So I would like to make that as least painful for me as possible.
I don't know. I think pre-prod we can figure out what we do later after we figure out staging and production. But for staging and production, I think, like I've already said, my view would be that we have per user console servers per environment, cool. And you would just have a chat ops command to spin it up, and maybe hopefully we could spin it up in your region, so the latency isn't so bad, so it's like not terrible, right? And then you would have a server. Like I think for me, the first iteration would be simply to use Terraform, and instead of using SSH. Instead of using user groups for SSH access on the console server, we have Terraform spin up per user console boxes for all the SREs in the region, whatever region they want. And then we have individual, and then only you have SSH access to that.
Yeah, gotcha.
To that server, and then we start, you know, and then we start figuring out how we want to configure the servers so that it'll be useful for everyone. And yeah. So that is what I was thinking would be the first iteration. Yep. We could do this manually in Terraform to start, then work out the automation later. I mean, I think we're not talking a lot about too much effort here. I think we could probably bang it out in a few days.
If you want, and maybe I'm getting way off topic here, instead of Terraform, we could actually use a small Kubernetes cluster running in GCP and Google Cloud Connector. So you send Kubernetes custom resources to it to create these objects. And then we use, and then when you delete the object, it deletes the VM. So we're actually using CRDs to power this, but maybe I'm just getting way off topic there. Just to me, that feels nicer than Terraform, because an object exists in Kubernetes for the lifespan. You delete the object, it goes away. Whereas Terraform, you kind of got to like add it and remove it. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm thinking just to use our existing Chef to configure things, you know, and all this. Like, I mean, it just, although we're trying to get away from Chef, I think it's probably going to be here for the foreseeable future because of our snowflakes. So maybe that makes the most sense. But that's what I was thinking would be the first iteration for this.
Graeme, your idea is great as a second iteration or third iteration, right? Like I prefer Jar's idea of using the tooling that we right now have, even if it's manual, and then once we actually get into the workflow, we can find better solutions. I know that we have some talented engineers in the team who can actually get this done. So,
Sure.
but once we know exactly what we need, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
we right now don't know that. So yeah.
Okay, so to recap then, I have no problems with anything we've discussed so far in terms of getting that concrete process around some concrete control around elevated or unelevated access to staging and prod. Makes sense. I think once we get that in place, I can reach out to other parts of the team like Devin who have that in other Kubernetes clusters and get them to move to that as well. In terms of development workflow, how that works, I'll be honest, I'm still not entirely sure, but it sounds like that's less important to us at this point, and we can kind of talk about that later, how we want to make that work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like right now, primary concern, let's put some proper controls over what we hold dear, and then we'll think about more about development workflow. That one is tricky. That one is really tricky. So I mean, I'm not saying that production is not. I'm just saying that one will take a bit more time.
Yeah, no, you're right. Because it's like with production, really, there's not that many times you really need to do stuff with production. But with dev, you know, you're always kind of like, you know, try this, hammer this around, and you got Git repos to consider because you're trying to, you know, do stuff and push your fork. And so it is trickier. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. And I do like the ability at the moment with the current console setup, you do have to, if you do want to do some complicated stuff, you've got to install a bunch of stuff yourself. And there's a lot of, you got to set up the context yourself. And so I would love to just be like, yep, I need to go in. I know everything's going to work. I don't have to think about tools or anything. I don't have to, you know, tell any. So I do actually think that is a huge value gain we can do straight away as well. And that will make people's lives easier.
Cool. I need to drop out. Graeme, thank you so much for this great discussion.
That's all right. Thank you very much for taking the time, everyone, to talk to me. I know it's probably early for people, so I do appreciate that.
I'll chat later with you. Bye.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.
Amy, before we end the call, do you have any comments or any experience around this stuff?
No comments at this stage. I'm going to
come
to the early editions, but I have some time to think about things before this afternoon. So yeah, no, it sounds sensible. So yeah, cool. happy to continue.
Cool. All right, then I think we can end the call. We're going to have another discussion about this at the demo meeting, and you can watch the recording, Graeme. And cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Talk to you later.
Bye.